I gathered my equipment and stepped from the train. Already hundreds of men in olive-drab uniforms, loaded with the variety of equipment and weapons that characterizes the American soldier, were disentangling themselves from the freight cars. I decided that the little engineer must have thought we had not played fair with his 48 cars. There was not a car in my section of the train which did not disgorge at least 43 men, plus equipment. The equipment would more than make up for the absence of the 8 horses. "I company over here!" I shouted above the noise of the detrainment. "Column 02's facing this way. Headquarters 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th. The milling around began to take on a semblance of unity of purpose. I signalled forward, and the column began an accordion-like action of moving off, a man here and there making a last-minute adjustment of his pack or overcoat. We moved through the gate in the dirty concrete fence of the station yard and out to the main street of the town. I dropped back from my position at the head of the column to survey the long line of men, tall ones, short ones, not unlike similar companies I had commanded in the US before coming overseas. Perhaps there was something about the way these men walked the confident swagger, perhaps. I think I would have known, even had I been one of the silent, stone-faced civilians staring at us from the open doorways and windows along the way, that underneath those stubbly growths of beard and those wisps of straw from the boxcars clinging to the unpressed uniforms lay a wealth of battlefield experience. Company 1, 23D Infantry, I thought. You fought your way ashore in Normandy on D+1. You battled to the top of Hill 192 to pave the way for the St. Lo breakout. You stormed the ring of pillboxes at Brest and had your number reduced to 50 in the explosion as the Germans blew them up in your faces. And now they give you a company commander fresh from the States. They ask you to put your faith in me. I felt weak and ineffectual. I quickened my pace, regaining my place at the head of the column as we crossed a temporary US Army bridge, which had replaced the demolished ancient stone structure over the gurgling mountain stream which ran through the centre of the village. We approached the last houses on the edge of the town, and the road began its steep ascent to the hilltop beyond. Now a dirty little French boy came running out to yell some newly learned Yankee curse word at us as we passed. Now a little girl bashfully thrust a bouquet of flowers into a soldier's hands and turned to disappear behind her mother's skirts in a doorway. Our column plodded slowly up the hill, the full field packs beginning to assert their weight. Sweat formed on my body, and I wished that I had carried my heavy GI overcoat instead of wearing it. But the early evening mountain air did nip at my face and felt refreshingly cool on my hands as I took off my heavy GI woolen gloves. My nose began to run from the cold acquired on the long train ride, but I couldn't reach my handkerchief through the bundlesome overcoat and equipment. The road made a sharp bend to the left as we reached the crest. It was light enough to see the deep valley to the right, with its roving stream following the contour of the railroad track on the mountainside beyond. "Damn!" a heavily breathing soldier in my headquarters group exclaimed between clenched teeth. "I sure hope it levels off before we reach the front. It'd be a son of a bitch to fight in this kind of country." "We're still a hell of a ways from the front," another said. "How far you reckon it is, Captain?" I looked back. It was Private First Class Henry Croteau of East Hartford Con. He had been the company interpreter and the company commander's runner through the campaign in France. "About 20 or 30 miles, the colonel says," I replied. The road continued upgrade and we walked on in silence. The cold wind felt good to my face. I was conscious of a heavy mist about us which slowly turned into a fine rain, which, coupled with the overcast that had plagued us all day, boded no good for a bivouac in the open. A mile down the road we met the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Paul V. Tuttle of San Antonio, Texas. He was a tall, handsome young West Pointer of about 28 years. His short brown hair was beginning to grey slightly at the temples, and his face had a ruddy glow from the wind as he waited for us beside the road. He motioned me to a field a few hundred yards down the road and designated a spot on the right for my company. "We'll bivouac here for the night, Mac," he said. "There's a haystack over there. Let the men heat K-rations with the boxes, but leave off the other fires. There might be some little birds around, you know." I congratulated myself upon the good fortune that had given me such an understanding battalion commander for my first combat experience, and turned off the road at the place he had designated. I directed the platoons to their respective areas in the field, and noted that K, L, M, and battalion headquarters companies were following us in. Our arrival seemed to be the signal for the clouds to burst. The mist that had become a drizzle now became a torrent. The men scrambled madly to get their packs undone, and shelter halves spread over equipment. Then followed the rush for the haystack. The field was already a soggy mass of mud, and the downpour of rain was making it muddier by the minute. I joined my headquarters group in heating the cans of K-rations over the oblong cardboard boxes they came in. The rain and wind made it hard to get the fires started at first, but the rain soon slackened. I wondered how I could force down another K-ration meal after 5 days of the same monotonous food aboard the train, but I found that anything edible tasted good after the hike from the station. Colonel Tuttle sent a messenger with the message for me to report to him for instructions for the morning. My executive officer said he would fix up our tent and put my equipment in out of the rain while I was gone. He was First Lieutenant Rudolph A., Sparky Flame of Rosati Mower, a husky young officer who had already qualified for 3 Purple Hearts and was on his way to flirt with the 4th. When I returned, he was snoring loudly on his own side of the little pup tent, and most of the company had turned in for the night. I walked through the disorderly rows of tents, and the thick mud made sucking noises as it pulled at my overshoes. I sought out the platoon leaders. I found First Lieutenant Long H. Goffigan of Cape Charles V., my first platoon leader, and First Lieutenant Alfred Ante of Evansville IND, my 3D platoon leader, sleeping in the same tent, First Lieutenant Thomas D. Brock of Plymouth Meechee, my 2D platoon leader, and First Lieutenant Robert H. Glasgow of Arlington NJ, weapons platoon leader, were together. I told them the plans for the morning and walked to the end of the field where I found 2 guards huddled in their raincoats. I told them to pass the word on to the guards who relieved them to awaken the company at 5 o'clock. We would have another K-ration breakfast before loading on trucks to continue the move. I went back to my tent and pulled off my muddy overshoes and crawled inside, but I couldn't go to sleep. Sparky had pushed well over toward my side of the tent in his sleep, and a mound of dirt positioned itself squarely in the small of my back. It had seemingly escaped the softening process of the heavy rain. My mind began to peruse the duties that were before me. In perhaps 1 day, and at the most 3 days, I would be leading these men against a team of trained killers. I wondered how I would react. These men so deserved the best in leadership. Could I give it to them? They could boast a glorious combat record already, and I knew nothing. Suddenly, all my long hours of training for just such a role as this seemed pitifully inadequate. If only there was some way I could know just what it was like. It seemed incredible that this group of hardened combat veterans could accept an inexperienced youth of 21 to lead them into battle, simply because he happened to come to them wearing a set of flashy bars on his shoulders. If only I could look into their minds to see what they were thinking. I was awakened the next morning by someone rapping on my tent and shouting that it was 5 o'clock. It was dark, but the rain had stopped. That would make it slightly less disagreeable to roll up wet shelter halves and damp equipment to strap to one's back. We had scarcely enough time to heat a K-ration meal before battalion headquarters sent a runner to tell us to load on the trucks. The truck ride took us through a portion of Belgium before we crossed the border into the Duchy of Luxembourg. Civilians began to come to their doors to greet us with enthusiastic cheers and 2 fingers upraised in the V for Victory sign. In one town, an effigy of Adolf Hitler hung suspended by the neck from a rope above the road. Everywhere there were spontaneous expressions of gratitude. I felt a surging feeling of pride within me that for the moment pushed my fears of the future into the background, if war but consisted of only travel and cheers from a grateful populace. We crossed the Luxembourg border and entered Belgium once again, noticing an increase in the military traffic. As our trucks rolled into Schoenberg, Belgium, numerous command post and hospital installations, the increased number of German shop signs, and the apathy of the civilians told us we could not be far from Germany. Our convoy turned off the highway at Schönberg and wound slowly up a sandy dirt road leading into the thick fir forests beyond the town. We rode on, and the forest seemed of an impenetrable depth. The sandy road gave out eventually, and we found ourselves on an unimproved trail that had become a morass of mud from unaccustomed heavy traffic. Our convoy came to a halt. We had reached the spot for our bivouac. Beneath the dense covering of the fir trees, our kitchens were already set up. They had arrived from France by motor the evening before. An appetizing supper of hamburgers and vegetables awaited us, but it proved too much for my stomach after the week's diet of K-rations, and I suffered pains from overeating. Darkness had fallen, and the company was beginning to turn in for the night when I was called to battalion headquarters. The colonel had set up a small command post tent in the woods. A gasoline lantern took some of the chill off the night air inside. The other company commanders were already there. I was handed 5 maps, one for myself and one for each of my platoon leaders. The colonel did not waste much time. He said, "I'd like to give you the information I have so you can get back and get some sleep." My pulse quickened. "So this is it," I said to myself, using a phrase that every replacement uses 1,000 times before he ever actually reaches combat. I would soon know if I could take it. I would soon know if I could justify the faith of the men from Company 1. "It looks as if we've finally drawn a good assignment," Colonel Tuttle continued, and I breathed somewhat easier. Already whirling visions of attacking formidable Siegfried Line pillboxes had been flashing through my mind. "We're to relieve the 28th Division in the defence of a stretch along the Siegfried Line. It's supposed to be a quiet sector, so they tell us. There've been a few small-scale German counterattacks in the area and some artillery and SP fire, but at least it's quieter than the attack." There were questions and a general discussion. "Now," the colonel continued, "we leave in the morning at 7 o'clock. Have your kitchens prepare a hot breakfast. They'll move up later under Lieutenant Koch. We'll go to a forward assembly area back of the line where you can issue more ammunition. Then we'll have time for reconnaissance, and the actual relief will take place tomorrow night." We dispersed to our company areas. In the darkness outside the tent, I noticed the flashes of artillery to the east, and the deep rumble of the big guns came from the distance. A voice in my brain kept repeating, "This is it! This is it!" I stumbled blindly through the dark forest in the direction of the company. I stopped by the first sergeant's tent, where I found First Sergeant Henry D. Albin of Houston, Texas, huddled in his tent with a raincoat over the entrance as a blackout curtain. He was a young, auburn-haired, red-faced Texan who drawled pleasantly when he talked. He was preparing the company morning report by flashlight. "How does it look?" he asked. "Not too bad," I answered. "It's the defence." "Could be worse then, I guess," he said. "If it ain't bad, it'll be the first time this outfit ever drew a good assignment." I asked him to send for the platoon leaders to receive the information I had about the situation. They soon gathered around the tent. I was beginning to give them the information when a soldier stepped from the darkness. "Is the first sergeant round?" the soldier asked. "Right here," Sergeant Albin answered. "I'm from the 9th Infantry, Sergeant," the soldier said. "We're bivouacked just across the way, and I got a ride over, so I figured I'd stop by to see my brother. I haven't seen him in some time, but he's in this company." "What's the name?" "Wagram," the soldier answered. "Wagram. His first name's—" The feeble light from the flashlight inside the tent shone briefly on the soldier's face. Yeah, I know," Sergeant Albin interrupted. "In the 3D platoon, with us at Brest, killed in action there. Our truck convoy wound its way back through the thick forest into Schönberg the next morning, and out again over the highway leading east. As we neared the German border, the road began a steep ascent to the mountains to our front. A big white signboard with glaring black letters told us what we were near. "You are now entering Germany, an enemy country. Be on the alert." I looked at my watch. It was 11:15 on the morning of October 3rd, 1944. We were entering the country at a point approximately 12 miles east of St. Vith, Belgium, in the Schnee-Eifel forest. The old iron border gate stood open, mud-splashed by the army traffic. The road twisted and turned like some giant snake slithering up the steep slopes. The boom of big artillery pieces grew nearer. We turned from the highway on a freshly ploughed dirt road to the left, and the drivers shifted gears as the big trucks sank into the mud. The artillery pieces that had heralded our approach appeared in a deep valley to our right behind grey puffs of smoke as they belched their big noise into the spaces beyond. Our convoy pulled to a halt, and the driver cut the ignition and jumped out to open the tailgate. I gathered my equipment and stepped out on the muddy ground. This was Germany. We lined up in the familiar column of twos on either side of the muddy road for the 2-mile walk to the forward assembly area. The overcast skies, with perpetual threat of rain, made a sticky murkiness of the atmosphere despite the nipping cold, and the accustomed perspiration of road marches appeared beneath our overcoats. We reached the assembly area in a thick scrub oak woods shortly after noon. We had no sooner halted and begun to disentangle ourselves from the burdensome packs than Captain Jimmy Anderson of Cushing Oakler, the battalion operations officer, rode up in a jeep. "Turn your company over to your exec and have him feed dinner," he said. "Your kitchen should be up shortly. Bring what officers you want to go on reconnaissance and come with me. The old man's ready to go right now. Be calm, be businesslike. This is the same as manoeuvres. Give some orders, start things moving. You're going to have a look at the German army." I turned and mumbled instructions to Sparky and sent for the 4 platoon leaders. Sergeant Raymond Savage of Mobile, Allah, walked over to me. He was my communications sergeant, a small, good-looking young Southerner who spoke slowly in a matter-of-fact Alabama drawl. I had come to know him better than anyone else in the company thus far. He had a friendliness that was difficult to resist. "You going up, Captain?" he asked. Savage had a way of never slurring the title of captain, but pronouncing both syllables clearly despite his deep Southern accent. "Yeah," I said, making an effort at nonchalance. "Right away." "Can I go with you?" he asked. "I'd like to check on the communications setup." "I'm afraid not, Savage," I answered. "There's only one jeep, and I have to take the platoon leaders." "Okay," he said, as if he had half expected a refusal. "But watch yourself, Captain." His face looked worried. "Don't go sticking your neck out the first thing, and for God's sake hide those damned captain's bars." I looked at the shiny objects on my shoulders and hastily pulled them off and stuffed them into my pockets. The platoon leaders arrived. We climbed into the company jeep driven by Private First Class James Earnhardt of Mooresville, North Carolina, and moved down the trail to join the other company commanders. The road to the battalion command post of the unit we were to relieve twisted in and out of the woods beneath low-hanging limbs. We reached a clearing. A sign said, "Windshields covered beyond this point." We crossed a hill and saw the little German farming town of Groff-Kampkenberg with its closely clustered houses and barnyards and the inevitable manure piles. We ploughed through the black filth of mud that covered the road and pulled up to a white house in the centre of the town. Here and there an artillery shell had plunged through a roof or knocked off the corner of a chimney. A dead cows had become for us a sort of symbol of the war in France, lay with legs upstretched in the open field to the left of the road. A guide from the company we were to relieve joined us, and I heard Colonel Tuttle admonishing us to return by 3:30 p.m, and the guide was saying, "Ready?" and I was swallowing and answering, "Yes." We had come as far as we could by vehicle, but the guide said we had 1.5 miles yet to go. We ran across an open hill on the east edge of town because the guide said the enemy could observe us from the towering blue hills to our front. We continued in a narrow valley, and I tried to note each terrain feature as we passed. It would be night when I would lead the company over the route. I noted that the terrain was no longer mountainous, but had given way to a series of rolling hills and valleys. We crossed a slight knoll, and the anti-tank wall of the Siegfried Line came suddenly into view. It looked like a prehistoric monster coiled around the hillsides. The concrete dragon's teeth were like scales upon the monster's back, or maybe headstones in a kind of crazy cemetery. We crossed the anti-tank wall. The open mouths of 2 pillboxes yawned at us from the slope ahead. We passed the pillboxes and skirted the left edge of a thick patch of fir trees. The ground was covered with black holes where shells had hit and exploded. The dragon's teeth coiled across our path again, and we crossed them again. Tucked into the slope of a higher hill to our front was a row of 8 concrete pillboxes, completely dug into the hillside except for their faces. "We'll have to run again here," the guide said, and pointed to a high slope to our right front peopled by a similar row of pillbox giants. "That's theirs." We ran across the ploughed field and halted for breath at the entrance to a pillbox at the crest of the slope. The entrance had been filled in with dirt. 2 soldiers rose up to view us from shallow slit trenches dug near the entrance. "You better keep low," one of them said. "They've been shooting here all day." "This is part of L Company," our guide announced, ignoring the warning except for a quick look toward the speaker that must have said thanks. We imitated our guide's half-crouch as we ran from the pillbox to a thin hedge that ran parallel with the ridge along its crest. Tilda, I could still see the enemy pillboxes in the distance to our right, and they could very evidently see us. But I realized as I looked around that our guide had taken the only concealment the ground afforded us. I could discern the general outline of the defensive position we were to occupy. The battalion's position was to be in the shape of a giant horseshoe, with Company 1 embedded in the centre of the arc. We would have been exposed from the other side of the hedge as well. I imitated the guide's cautiousness as we advanced, but I was strangely unafraid. I was a bit awed by the momentousness of it. You are inside the Siegfried line, but thus far it had been child's play. We continued for 200 yards when the guide suddenly veered into the hedge, and we found ourselves in the shaded backyard of a 2-story farmhouse. We followed the guide in a back window, and I knew we had reached our destination. We found the company commander, a first lieutenant, in a small, low cellar, illuminated only by a dim kerosene lantern that needed its shade washed. There were men in every conceivable sleeping position all over the floor. The lieutenant suggested that we move upstairs where we could talk, and we made our way again up the dark, narrow staircase that led from the cellar. When we reached the light of the first floor, I saw that the lieutenant's eyes were bloodshot, and a half-week's growth of beard covered his face. His voice trembled slightly when he talked, and he would start at the slightest noise. He asked if I had my platoon leaders with me, and I indicated my lieutenants. He sent 2 runners for his own platoon leaders. "I can't get the 3D platoon leader now," he said. "Can't reach the 3D platoon in daylight, but he can go with the 2D platoon. He can see the positions from there." He interrupted himself to admonish 2 soldiers to move more quietly when they walked. "By the way, they're all sergeants. I have only 1 officer left besides myself." He flinched perceptibly at the sound of a door closing. I conferred with my platoon leaders, and we set our time for reassembly at the company command post in the farmhouse at 3 o'clock. The company commander and I went upstairs to the forward room on the 2nd floor. From the upstairs window, I could see a towering ridge rising to our front, spotted with poorly camouflaged pillboxes and patches of trees. A small farming town lay in a valley between us and the high ridge. "It's not too bad a position," the lieutenant said. "You all have winter clothes, and we haven't had a chance to get ours yet. That'll be a hell of a big help." "Jerry throws quite a bit of artillery and mortars at you," he continued, "and we've had some casualties, but it was their own fault for moving around in the daytime when they knew they shouldn't. We haven't had any counterattacks or patrols hit us yet, and we've been here 15 days. K Company on our right got the living hell knocked out of them 2 nights ago. Swarm of Kraut infantry hit 'em along with a flame-throwing half-track, caught a lot of men in a pillbox and stampeded the company. My right platoon started falling back until I got 'em stopped. They counterattacked the next morning, however, and got their positions back. They found some of the men who hadn't run still holding their foxholes. The attack against K Company with the loss of the men in the pillbox was the basis for a battalion order to move out of all pillboxes," the lieutenant said. That was the reason for the I Company CP being in the farmhouse. It had originally been in a bunker-type pillbox to the right rear of the house, and since there was no other spot available, it was necessary to move into the crowded farmhouse, even though it was in L Company's area. I decided immediately that I would take the chance and move my CP into the pillbox when we came up that night. The farmhouse was too crowded. A closer look through the window revealed a line of foxholes a few yards in front of the house. The lieutenant explained that these belonged to the right flank platoon of L Company. A small trail running along the right of the farmhouse was the dividing line between the companies and led down into the valley to the German-held town which my map labelled Utfeld. The 3 rifle platoon positions my men would occupy extended 500 yards to the right of the trail. There were no windows on the right side of the farmhouse, so we moved downstairs and out into the backyard to view the platoon positions. "Your 3D platoon on the right has it worst," the lieutenant said, pointing toward the outline of foxholes on a small knoll to the right front. "They're completely exposed. Can't even raise their heads out of their holes in daylight without some goddamned kraut taking a shot at them. We can't contact them by runner except at night. There's a 200-yard gap on their right before K Company starts, which ain't good, of course." Over the entire area, the Germans from the high ridge to the front and right front had perfect observation of our positions. Their view was supplemented by that of those who occupied the high ridge on our left, but the observation from the left was restricted by the foliage surrounding the farmhouse. I decided to dispose my company initially as the lieutenant had done. We could make changes later. I would have preferred holding one of my rifle platoons in a support position, but it seemed unwise, for our company frontage was great. My platoon leaders reassembled at the farmhouse. Our guide had waited to go back with us, and upon his suggestion we moved back in groups of 2 to give the enemy a less profitable target. I decided to wait until the last to leave. Lieutenant Brock, my 2D platoon leader, elected to remain with me. I was filled with misgivings about the return trip until we should reach the concealment of the patch of fir trees. But when the other platoon leaders drew no fire as they crossed the open space, my fears partially subsided. Brock and I made our way in a half-crouch beside the hedge, more conscious now that our only concealment from the enemy depended upon our blending with the foliage on our right. We reached a point opposite the pillbox where we had encountered the men in the slit trenches on the trip forward, and started out on a run across the crest of the hill. I had almost reached the cover of the pillbox when the projectiles from a 20mm anti-aircraft gun began to crack overhead. I hit the ground instinctively. I found myself behind a small knoll formed by the embedded pillbox and was thus protected from the enemy fire. I was beginning to congratulate myself on choosing the position when I looked to my right. 5 feet from me lay a German soldier, crumpled as he had fallen and bloated in death. It was my first view of a dead man, and I tried to avoid the revulsion that filled me by quickly turning my eyes away. We crawled down to the face of the pillbox and paused a moment to catch our breath. I started the journey again by dashing across the ploughed field that led to the first row of Dragon's Teeth, expecting at any moment to see the bullets from the anti-aircraft gun kick up the dirt around my feet. I could hear Lieutenant Brock panting as he ran behind me, but the sound of bullets did not come. In its stead came the sharp crack and heavy explosion that I knew must be mortar fire falling behind me. It sounded as if the shells were falling on the crest of the ridge we had so recently left, but I took no time to look back. I increased my speed and dived behind a clump of bushes next to the outer row of Dragon's Teeth. There would be no protection from those bushes against the mortar shells, but I was comforted by their concealment. I lay there panting. It could not have been more than a minute before Brock joined me, but it seemed like 10. I sighed in relief. His face was white and his breath came in gasps, but he was unhurt. When he had regained his breath, he stammered out his story. "Those damn mortars," he said. "The concussion must have thrown me at least 3 feet into the air and then flat on my face on the ground." We made an effort to laugh at his narrow escape and continued the journey past the patch of fir trees and into Grofkampkenberg. In Grofkampkenberg, Colonel Tuttle told me that my company would be the first to move up that night. We would leave our assembly area around 10 o'clock in order to begin effecting the relief at midnight. The other 2 rifle companies would leave at 2-hour intervals thereafter. Thus, one company would be completely on position before another had begun. We rode our jeep back to the company assembly area. The mess sergeant, Staff Sergeant Lee W. Threadgill of Franklin, Texas, had saved dinner for us, but the company was eating supper when we arrived. We ate the 2 meals together, and I gave final instructions to the platoon leaders as we ate. The men were to carry 3 meals of K-rations and their blanket rolls with them. They would leave their gas masks and duffel bags to be transported by service company. I arranged to have my jeep driver follow L Company's jeep to the L Company CP after darkness, and bring with him a load of ammunition and our heavier weapons, the light machine guns and 60mm mortars. Darkness had fallen and a misty rain was coming down when I completed the arrangements. I climbed into the back of the kitchen truck and smoked a cigarette and listened to the slow tick of my watch as 10 o'clock rolled nearer. "This is it! This is it!" My brain kept repeating madly, over and over. I must not appear afraid. I must give these men confidence in me despite the fact that they know I'm inexperienced. They were playing their parts well. I had been unable to detect any attitude of distrust in their actions, and I had searched their faces for long periods at a time. I must keep that confidence. I must! "Scared, Captain?" Sergeant Savage asked. "A little," I admitted. I took a long, slow drag on my cigarette. "We all are," Savage said. "We always are." The rain had stopped, and somewhere there was a moon that was hidden by the clouds as we collected our equipment and set out on the night march to the front. It was a slow, fatiguing march under the burden of the mounting tension and the heavy equipment. Our guide of the afternoon joined us in Grof-Kampkenberg. I was surprised because I had not expected he would be with us. After we had passed the patch of fir trees, the guide led us in a more direct line toward our objective than we had travelled on the reconnaissance. We crossed the Dragon's Teeth and began the ascent of the slope beyond, and I made out the outline of the slight rise which would be the pillbox I was to use for a command post. I stumbled and looked down at my feet. An American soldier, fully clothed even to his helmet, lay on his back with glassy eyes turned skyward, his arms outstretched. His body was almost twice its normal size. I shuddered involuntarily. The shock of almost stepping upon the body before seeing it left me weak inside. The guide stooped down and retrieved the automatic rifle that lay beside the body, swinging the weapon over his shoulder. "Must be one of our BR men," he said casually. "He headed for battalion the other day. There was a mortar barrage. We hadn't heard from him since." We reached the entrance to the pillbox in the rear of the farmyard a few moments later. Guides from the rifle platoons of the 28th Division Company asked in hoarse stage whispers what platoon it was. I directed my company headquarters group to the pillbox and dispatched the rifle platoons with their guides into the darkness beyond, telling them that we would have telephone lines to them as soon as possible. I grew openly nervous lest we be caught by an enemy artillery barrage with a large number of men on the exposed hilltop. The lieutenant from the 28th Division appeared, and we moved together down the incline that led to the circuitous entrance of the pillbox. A giant hole had been dug into the ground on the crest of the hill, and the massive concrete emplacement had been constructed within, its entrance facing the rear of the farmhouse across the trail. Its roof was constructed of 4 feet of reinforced concrete with 3 feet of dirt making a slight mound above. The walls were 6 feet thick. I noted the size of the big bunker as we entered. It was 16 feet square and 8 feet high. The men from my headquarters were arranging their equipment on 3 rows of iron frame bunks with laced rope bottoms that were suspended in tiers of 3 each from the ceiling along each side. In the left front corner, an iron door led to a small concrete storage room. A candle burned on a table at the front of the pillbox. It cast flickering shadows on the walls and revealed a hand-operated ventilation device against the left wall. On the right, next to the floor, was a small door that open revealed a fireplace that ended in the tin chimney I had seen silhouetted against the sky outside. Signs and mottos in German script were on each wall. The concrete floor was littered with empty cardboard cartons and K-ration tins. The air was cold and damp and stale, and smelled of dust and dried man-sweat. Sergeant Albin was busy with the morning report. Private First Class Lupe Naranjo of Aquadulce, Texas, and Private First Class Walter Zellin of Boston, Mass. The 2 men who served as messengers from the battalion CP waited to take the report back with them. Sergeant Savage was attaching the company's field telephone to a line that entered the room through a small slit, which commanded a view of the entrance and could be closed by pushing a small concrete block across it, thus blacking out the pillbox completely. "I ought to have communication with battalion in a couple of minutes, Captain," Savage said. "I'm using the 28th Infantry's old line." He soon made contact with battalion, and there was a call waiting for us. "It's L Company," he said. "NAFAC has got our mortars and machine guns and some ammunition at their CP. He told him that we would have someone there to pick them up in a few minutes, and then he gathered up his wire-laying equipment. Private First Class Luther T. Blackburn of Oklahoma City, Okla, one of the SCR 300 operators, would assist him. They would lay telephone wire to the forward platoons. A man from the 28th Division came in to report to his company commander that messengers from all 4 of his platoons had reported outside with the information that the platoons had all pulled out. The lieutenant turned to me. "Is there anything else then, Captain?" he asked. "No, I think not," I said, trying in vain to think of something I might have forgotten and a bit alarmed that soon I would be entirely on my own. I reported our progress to Colonel Tuttle, and the lieutenant talked with his own battalion commander and asked me to tell his CO that I was satisfied. I did so, and the lieutenant prepared to leave, taking my 2 battalion runners with him. He seemed overjoyed at the prospect of leaving, and I wondered if someday I would be just as happy to leave this area. And how long would that someday be? A week? 2 weeks? A month? 2 months? There was no way of knowing. We might sit here until the war ended, or we might leave tomorrow. I closed my eyes for a brief moment and murmured a silent prayer. The lieutenant was gone. I was on my own. Lieutenant Glasgow, Scotty, my weapons platoon leader, whose love for Scotch whisky and insistence that his name was pronounced with a G and not a CE were standing jokes in the company, came in a few minutes after the lieutenant from the 28th had left. He said his platoon CP was in the back room of the house across the trail. He was setting up 1 mortar in the rear of the house and the other 2 beside the rearmost and smaller of the 2 wooden sheds behind the house. The positions afforded no cover, only concealment, but they were the only available positions. L Company was using all the pillboxes to our rear. I told him that the machine guns and mortars were at L Company's CP and directed him there. He asked for several men from my company headquarters to help him carry ammunition and left with his mortar section to bring up the equipment. Sergeant Savage called over the sound-powered telephone from the 1st Platoon, and then from the 2D and the 3D. I was glad when I heard the first whistle over the phone that indicated that the lines were in. A whistle, plus the call sign of the party desired, was the signal, since all platoons were on a party line. We had adopted the same call signs for both telephone and SCR 536, the famed little walkie-talkies, using nicknames of the platoon leaders, or their last names, plus the numerical designation of the platoon long one for the 1st Platoon, Brock 2, Anti 3, Scotty 4, and merely CP for the company command post. I was greatly relieved that the communications were in. I wondered how the lieutenant from the 28th Division had endured the nervous tension of the pillbox positions for 15 days, without communications to his platoons. 1 platoon, or all platoons, might have been completely overrun by the enemy before a foot messenger could get back to the command post if he got back. First, Sergeant Ulbin made up a guard roster from the company headquarters group. Each man would guard outside the pillbox in 2-man shifts that would change every 2 hours. Savage and Blackburn would split the night on the telephones. Sparky went to sleep early so that he could take over from me later, thus ensuring that one of us would be awake at all times. Scotty returned with the machine guns and mortars at 2 o'clock. I didn't like the prospect of hand-carrying all our supplies from the L Company CP, exposing the carrying detail to enemy shelling for long periods, but it seemed impractical to bring a jeep as far forward as my command post. I didn't plan to sleep at all the first night. Now that we were on position and the difficulties of moving in no longer worried me, I was filled with a growing fear that the Germans might hit us with a counterattack. In reality, such German action would have been an attack, but like all GIs, I thought of any German attack as a counterattack. I decided that the enemy must surely know that new troops were moving in and would attempt to dislodge us, while we might still be disorganized. Despite my fears, I was confident that company I would meet with little difficulty in holding the positions. Already we had communications which far surpassed those of the unit we had relieved, and where they had had no anti-tank defences, except a small string of mines on the trail running along our left flank, we had 7 rocket launchers, bazookas. I had placed 2 of the launchers with each forward platoon and kept 1 for the protection of the CP. And already I was thoroughly imbued with the spirit common among all infantrymen that my outfit is the best damned outfit in the whole damned army. It could boast of a record to prove it. I was certainly not a veteran in combat, but I was no novice in my esteem for Company 1. I talked with the 3 rifle platoon leaders over the telephone. They were thoroughly dissatisfied with their positions. The foxholes were little more than depressions in the ground, they said, and poorly disposed. Both the 1st and 2D platoons wanted to occupy 2 pillboxes in their areas. Already they had begun to dig out the entrances, which the preceding unit had covered with a bulldozer, to prevent the Germans from reoccupying them if they were retaken. The 3D platoon was changing the disposition of a few foxholes, but little could be done to lessen the daylight vulnerability of their position. The platoon leaders said there were about 15 corpses in different spots over the company area, both German and American dead. Sergeant Savage said he was sliding under a fence while laying the wire to the platoons, when he reached out and grasped the bare chest of a dead German. I told them I would call battalion the next day in an effort to get a graves registration unit to remove the dead. Lieutenant Brock said his platoon had discovered a US tank destroyer 75 yards in front of his position. A 2-man crew that had been there 3 days since their vehicle had become stuck in the mud in the draw still occupied the TD. The 4th platoon said there was another TD a few yards to the left of the shed occupied by 2 of the mortar squads, but it had been completely knocked out by a German shell. The short candle in the pillbox flickered and went out. The command post settled down to an extravaganza of snores, an occasional ring of the battalion telephone, and low conversation between Savage and me. The routine was broken occasionally by the surprised comments of a sleeper, as another man awakened him to go on guard. Savage began to nod from sleepiness, and his head fell forward on the table. I did not awaken him. I was alone with my thoughts in the cold, damp darkness. 11 men in a pillbox. 11 men who must live from day to day, never thinking of the immediate future, but only of the infinity when the war would someday be over. There was Sparky and First Sergeant Ulbin, Savage, Blackburn, Croteau, and me. There was Private First Class Willie Hagan, the tobacco-chewing 39-year-old army regular who kept us laughing with sage tactical wisdom and served as first platoon runner. Then there was Private First Class Angelo Buttari of Boston, 2D platoon runner who had lost 2 brothers already in the war. Private First Class Hubert Berger of Memphis 10. 3D platoon runner who was 18 years old and read his Bible every night. Private First Class Kenneth Lampton of Detroit Meek. Weapons platoon runner who was also 18 and corresponded with college girls from Michigan. And Private First Class Erling G. Salberg of Fargo, ND, who was 19 and cleanly good-looking and the headquarters bazooka man. The cooks and jeep drivers, the supply sergeant and the mail orderly had been left behind with service company to keep us supplied. The changing of the guard at 4 o'clock revealed that it was raining outside, a slow, cold, miserable drizzle. I thought of the men in the forward platoons in their exposed foxholes, with no protection from the elements except shelter halves stretched across their holes, and nothing between them and the hostile killers in front of us but the muzzles of their own rifles. I had admired the unglamorous infantry soldier before, but as the rain continued to fall and the night grew colder, my pride at being a part of this dirty, miserable infantry knew no bounds. The night wore on, quiet but for the pounding of our own artillery on the ridges to our front, sometimes a distant rumble, sometimes a heavy cracking explosion not far away. I nodded as the urge for sleep protested against denial, but then I would moisten my eyelids with saliva or pound my knuckles against my forehead, and the remembrance of the deep-rooted fear of a German counterattack would brim me back to my senses. Around 6 o'clock, I stepped across the trail to the shed behind the farmhouse to urinate. and I saw that faint vestiges of dawn were appearing across the distant hills. There was something spooky about it. I returned to the pillbox and woke up savage. We opened a breakfast K-ration and devoured its chopped ham and egg mixture with a cup of coffee between us, which Savage heated in his canteen cup. The long night was over. We awakened Sparky and Blackburn and changed places with them. I slept with all my clothes on to combat the damp chill of the underground pillbox and to be prepared for any eventuality. Daylight would be no detriment to sleep, I realized as I climbed into the bunk. The pillbox was as dark in daytime as it had been at night. I slept well, except for occasional awakenings from the noise of someone sweeping out the pillbox, or to cough from the acrid smoke of burning cration cartons as the men awoke and heated their breakfasts. One of the men from the TD in the 2D platoon area came in around 9 o'clock to use the telephone. He wanted permission from his outfit to abandon the TD and return. He got his permission, and I went back to sleep. 12 rounds of enemy mortar fire fell 100 yards in rear of the pillbox around noon, but I scarcely noticed it as I turned over in my sleep. I heard Sparky talking with the platoon leaders in an effort to pick up the location from which the enemy weapons were firing, when 12 more rounds fell to the rear of the 3D platoon at 1 o'clock. I got up at 3 o'clock and dusted from my hair the loose dirt and straw that had fallen from the bunk above me, and wiped the sleep from my eyes with my hand. I had not shaved since the day we detrained at Longuyon, and the stubble felt rough on my face. I had difficulty finding a breakfast cration, since they were the least evil of the 3 meals, and disappeared more quickly than the dinners and suppers, but I found one and stepped to the entrance of the pillbox to heat it. Rain continued to fall in a thin, needlepoint spray. I talked with the platoon leaders again over the sound-powered telephone and got a list of the items that they wanted brought up with the rations after dark. I added a list of my own and called it in to the battalion supply officer. The main request was for several types of ammunition, including 60mm mortar shells adapted for firing from the M1 rifle with the aid of a grenade launcher. My men had found the expedient to be most effective in street fighting in Brest, and swore that it was more effective than either hand grenades or fragmentation rifle grenades. It, in effect, put the equivalent of 60mm mortars in the forward foxholes. I was standing a few feet outside the entrance to the pillbox when one of our own artillery shells whistled menacingly overhead. I started instinctively toward the safety of the pillbox. The men laughed at me and said, "That's ours." I felt foolish and wondered if I would ever be able to tell the difference between incoming and outgoing shells. An enemy artillery piece fired 10 rounds into the area around 5 o'clock. The barrage centered 100 yards to the rear of the CP in relatively the same position as the mortar barrage at noon, but the shells did no damage. The rain stopped around 6, but the weather stayed damp and cold, and the skies showed no signs of clearing. Night began to fall, and I yearned for the long days of summer, when the sun had not set until 10 or 11 o'clock. Night, with its long hours of mysteries and uncertainties, was the time to fear. Colonel Tuttle telephoned from battalion. He was planning to send a platoon of 57mm anti-tank guns into position around the farmhouse during the night, and wanted to know if I thought it possible to tow the guns all the way forward with jeeps. I was elated. A dread fear of the enemy's terror-provoking flame-throwing half-track had persisted since my initial conversation with the nervous lieutenant from the 28th Division. The presence of the anti-tank guns would practically wipe away the danger of the half-track. Yes, I thought it possible to tow the guns forward. Yes, yes, yes. When darkness came, Sergeant Albin rounded up the carrying detail to go for the rations and supplies at the L Company CP. He left only a skeleton force at the CP, 2 men on guard, Savage on the phones, and Lieutenant Flame and myself. But the detail was still too small. I called Scotty and he sent 2 squads of mortarmen and left only a skeleton crew on the 3rd gun. The carrying detail had been gone only 5 minutes when a call came from the 2D platoon. It was Technical Sergeant Rupert L. Middlebrook of Long Beach, California, the platoon sergeant. "There's some sort of track vehicle out to our front, Captain, about 600 yards, and it's headed this way." The phone seemed to be a conductor that sent an electric thrill through my body. The flame-throwing half-track I had so recently shelved into the back of my mind suddenly reared up before my eyes and began spurting hideous orange deadly flame over the area. A wave of fear possessed me. My body began to shake uncontrollably. My voice trembled despite my efforts to control it. I felt foolish at being afraid, and I hoped the others did not notice it, but I could not stop my body from trembling. "Get battalion!" I cried to Savage. I turned again to the sound-powered phone. "I'm getting battalion. We'll try to get artillery." And then, when that seemed inadequate, "Just what does it sound like?" "I can't tell exactly," Middlebrook said. "It might be a tank or a half-track, but the son of a bitch is headed this way. We've been hearing it some time, but I wanted to be sure before I called." Willie Hagan, on guard outside the CP, burst into the pillbox. "There's a FG tank headed this way, Captain. We can hear it plain out here. It's in front of the first platoon." I nodded to Willie, and Savage told him I was on that now. "Can you get a light to look at your map?" I asked Middlebrook. "I want you to tell me what artillery concentration you think might get it." "I can't use a light," he answered, "but it sounds like it's on that road that runs up through the town. Maybe you can figure close to it from your map and I can adjust." I adjusted my map to the faint light of the kerosene lantern we had borrowed from the L Company platoon in the farmhouse earlier in the day. Concentration number 221 was on the road leading out of the town. I would try that one first, and Middlebrook could adjust it by sound from his position. Savage handed me the battalion phone. I grasped it with one hand, keeping the platoon phone glued to the opposite ear. "I'm getting battalion now," I said into the sound-powered phone. "Make it snappy," a voice cut in that I knew was Lieutenant Goffigan. "This is Long, Captain. We can hear it plain now, and it's headed right this way, coming pretty fast." Captain Anderson was at the other end of the battalion wire. I made a desperate effort to control my trembling voice, but I knew that I failed. I outlined our situation hurriedly and called for the concentration. "Coming right up," Captain Anderson said. "Hold on." I waited for what seemed an interminable period. Long and Middlebrook discussed the situation in one ear. Lieutenant Ante, the 3D platoon leader, joined the discussion. He could hear the vehicle now, although he hadn't heard it at first. The battalion switchboard operator spoke in a voice that was maddening with its politeness. "Have you finished, sir? Have you finished, sir?" I said, "Waiting," and my mind echoed the words, "Waiting, waiting, waiting." I glanced at my watch. It had been only 2 minutes since I first talked with Captain Anderson, but it seemed more like 2 hours. My God, would the artillery never come? Long was talking again on the platoon phone. "What do you think now, Middlebrook? Sounds like it's stopped to me." A reprieve, a reprieve. I felt weak with relief inside. "Yeah, I think so too," Middlebrook answered. "It seems to have— No, there she comes again. It's a hell of a lot closer this time. What about the artillery, Captain?" The overwhelming fear returned, but a sudden melodious whistle of outgoing artillery played nocturnes in my ear. Captain Anderson's voice came simultaneously over the battalion telephone. "Hey, Mac, they're firing 3 rounds for you to adjust. Let me know what it looks like. On the way." I had but a moment to yell "on the way" in the platoon phone before I heard the crunch of the big shells in the distance. "What do you think, Middlebrook?" I asked. "I couldn't tell too well, Captain. I have to adjust by sound, and it sounded over to me." "This is Long, Captain. I can't see too well either, but I'd say it was 200 over. I couldn't adjust on deflection, but it seemed okay." For a fleeting moment I envied the calmness of their voices, then repeated their decision to Captain Anderson. 200 over, he repeated. "I'll ask them to give you a battery volley this time. How's that?" The time seemed much shorter before the whistle of the shells across. "I can hear it again," Long shouted over the phone. "But it's running away now. Let 'em raise it 100 and give it to 'em again." I repeated the directions. I had a quick enveloping feeling of elation over our apparent success. I could hear Captain Anderson repeating the sensing at the other end of the wire. 9 more rounds whistled overhead. The shells hit. "We must not have gotten it," Middlebrook said, "but we sure scared hell out of whatever it was. He's batting hell out of there now. You can hardly hear him, he's so far away. I sighed and glanced at Savage. He had been sitting with his ear practically in the phones. He gave a sly smile. I answered it with a broad beam of pleasure. Willie Hagan, who had surveyed the entire proceedings with a practised eye, turned and joined his companion on guard. I thanked Captain Anderson. Savage gave the battalion phone a slight ring to indicate that we had finished. The voice of the switchboard operator sounded musical now. "Have you finished, sir? Have you finished?" Even as I relaxed with relief at the exit of the enemy tank, if indeed it had been a tank, I began to think of the carrying detail which had left earlier for L Company's CP. The crack of mortar shells dropping unheralded from the sky, followed a fraction of a second later by the dull boom of explosions, reached my ears. I exchanged mutual looks of anxiety with Sparky and Savage, but there was nothing we could do but await the return of the detail and hope blindly they had escaped the barrage. I ran to the entrance of the pillbox and watched the orange light of the explosions as the last rounds fell. They seemed centred about 200 yards to the rear of the CP, directly on the crest of the ridge. I went back inside to the vigil beside the telephones to await their return. Each minute that passed increased my anxiety. The challenge of the guard outside some 15 minutes later, followed by a mumbled password and the noise of equipment being placed on the ground, was welcome to my ears. They were back. Sergeant Albin was the first to enter the pillbox. He said, "We just missed it. We had started back and the jeeps had just left when the mortars started popping. There were some L Company men still around and it hit right where they unloaded the equipment, but nobody got it." I was relieved for the moment, but decided I would not risk exposing the carrying detail to the same dangers again. "If the anti-tank guns make it okay tonight, we'll have NAFAC come all the way up with the supplies tomorrow night." Sergeant Albin told Savage to call the platoons to send carrying parties to take the food and equipment to the platoon areas, while he broke it down into platoon sections outside. "We've got coffee and steak sandwiches out here," he said, "but it's all cold as a witch's tit." The cold steak sandwiches tasted like food for a king. I knew they must have tasted even better to the cold, hungry riflemen and machine gunners in their rain-drenched foxholes, despite the cold and darkness in which they had to eat. The coffee was equally as cold, but the CP group and mortar section could reheat it over K-ration boxes. It was impossible for the riflemen to have fires even in daylight, so I called battalion for heating tablets, which burn with little smoke, but I was informed that they were a critical item and could not be obtained. I had asked battalion about the possibility of obtaining a graves registration unit to remove the bodies from the area, but I was told that no such unit was available. We would have to remove the bodies ourselves. The colonel finally weakened at my emphasised distaste and agreed to let us bury the German dead in an unoccupied pillbox, removing their identification papers to be sent to the rear, and to let us move the dead Americans to a spot in rear of my CP, where the chaplain would pick them up with a jeep and trailer for burial. The jeeps towing the 357mm anti-tank guns arrived around 9 o'clock, and I was impressed by the apparent lack of noise. The crews placed the guns in camouflaged positions in the brush around the farmhouse, covering both L and I Company fronts. I definitely decided that our own supply jeep could come all the way forward the next night. Naranjo and Zelin, the messengers from battalion, arrived and brought with them a wire-laying crew from the wire section of Battalion Headquarters Company. The crew laid a new wire from our CP to battalion on the return trip. Another crew from the artillery laid a line to the observer in the farmhouse, thus giving us 3 separate direct wires to the rear in case any of them should be knocked out by shelling. The battalion messengers brought copies of the Stars and Stripes, Army daily newspaper that most of the men read avidly. I already knew that there were never more than 12 copies for the whole company, and that the papers were usually 2 days old or more when we received them. The Spearhead, a 2-page mimeographed information sheet published each day by Division Special Services, with news compiled from radio broadcasts, usually reached us the evening of the day the news was broadcast. Around 11 o'clock I rose to make a trip to the forward platoons. I was not anxious to go. I could visualize 1,001 things taking place at the CP while I was gone that should have my attention, not the least of which might be a counterattack. But I wanted to have a closer look at the positions, and I felt my visit might make the men feel a bit better. At least it would show them that I was not afraid to visit them. Lieutenant Glasgow also wanted to visit the platoons and check his machine gun positions, so we decided the two of us would go together. It was not raining outside, but a chill wind blew across the hills and down the valleys to wrap the cold dampness of the night closely around us. The moon was nowhere to be seen, but a dull glow of light through the clouds kept the darkness from being completely black. We made our way down the forward slope of the shell-pocked rise that secreted the company command post and crossed a small stream that trickled down the bottom of the draw. I knew divided the 2D and 3D platoons and was defended farther to the left by the two pillboxes occupied by the 2D platoon. I saw to our front the outline of the knoll defended by the 3D platoon and heard the sound of shovels digging in the rocky earth. A chorus of coughs that I knew had been aggravated by the weather reached us as we came closer. We found the foxhole that the men called the platoon CP. Lieutenant Ante was around somewhere in the platoon area, but Technical Sergeant John M. Garcia of Noble Labie, the platoon sergeant, offered to go with us to find him. We found him talking with a group of men in his centre squad. His clothes were covered with dry mud, and his hands were equally grimy. Even in the darkness, I could see that a heavy growth of beard covered his face below his glasses. If I had not known him, I could not have picked him out as the platoon leader, so similar he was in appearance to the GIs digging in the floors of the foxholes around us. He escorted us around the platoon area, showing me the locations of his 3 squads, his bars, his bazookas. Everywhere the men turned to talk with us. I spoke briefly with the 3 squad leaders. Staff Sergeant Walter N. Stone of Athens, Gar, Sergeant Archie R. Jones of El Reno, Okla, and Sergeant Jack Webster, an Oklahoman whose adventure in running across an enemy minefield in France at such a speed that the mines exploded harmlessly to his rear was a story told to every replacement upon arrival in the company. Any idea that I might have entertained that my visit would bolster the morale of these men was overshadowed by the effect the visit had on my own morale. How they could smile and laugh and joke in their present condition I could not see, but each man had a cheery word for me as I approached. If I had possessed any misgivings that these men would weaken under the hardships of their cramped position and the adverse weather, they faded away into nothing. Their courage and fortitude made me admiringly envious and brought a lump to my throat. But Lieutenant Ante was worried. "I've got some men with terrible colds," he said. "This asshole weather. A couple of them have already asked to go back to the aid station, and I know they should go. But we're so damned short of men. I told them to try to stick it out until tomorrow night, and if they don't feel any better, then I'll send them on back." I suggested if he had some men he felt were too sick, then to send them to spend the night in my CP. "They can get a little sleep and come back down just before day in the morning," I said. I didn't really know what degree of sickness I expected him to interpret as too sick. As we reached the right flank of the platoon, I noticed a man huddled in his foxhole, trembling violently beneath a blanket which covered his head. Lieutenant Ante grasped him by the shoulder. "I thought I told you to get to digging this hole out deeper," he said sternly. The blanket came off the soldier's head. "You're putting me way off here by myself, so I'll be killed," he shouted, half sobbing. "You want to see me killed? There's nobody over here but—" "Shut up," Ante said. "You want the whole goddamned German army to hear you? Get to digging that hole. There are 2 men right here with you, and the next hole's 10 feet away. Nobody wants to see you killed." We turned away. I looked back over my shoulder at the soldier. "He's been like that ever since he's been with the platoon," Ante said. "Uses every excuse he can to get to the rear. He won't work to get himself warm like I try to get him to do. If he doesn't come around tonight, send him back to the CP," I said. "We can keep him there for a night and see how he turns out."